Done.
Okay. Hello, welcome to Reasonable Faith Adelaide. I'm Bronwyn Pearce, your host for tonight. The presentation topic for discussion tonight is titled Thinking About Evolution, Its Strengths and Weaknesses, Unpacking the Gaps and Problems Facing the Current Evolutionary Model. This topic is based on our speaker's book, Thinking About Evolution, 25 Questions Christians Want Answered. So on that note, I would like to welcome back biochemist, Christian apologist, Dr. Fazale Rana from Reasons to Believe. Thank you, Fuzz.
Hi, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your meeting this evening. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and share my screen real quickly. Oops. We did this earlier and it was seamless. And now, let's see here.
You're up.
Oh, having some troubles. All right, here we go. Sorry about this.
Okay.
I'm just, there we go. That's what I was hoping to do.
Great. Yep. Got it.
Okay, so let me go ahead and there's just no elegant way to do this that I can discern. So anyway, are you guys seeing that okay then?
Just a blank screen here at the moment.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Actually, it's but should be blank. Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to start this evening by actually showing you a picture of an item that sits in the living room in our home. And this is an old typewriter, a Corona typewriter. And my wife has an aunt that she's very close to, Aunt Mary Ellen. And we live in Southern California near Los Angeles. And my wife's aunt lives near Washington, D.C. So 2 or 3 times a year, my wife will travel across country to visit her aunt. And a few years ago, she was with her aunt and was up in the attic of her aunt's house. I'm not quite sure what prompted that, but her aunt said that if there's anything up there that you see that you like, you're more than welcome to take it with you. And my wife actually loves antiques, which it turns out is a good thing for me, because as I get older, it's nice to know that my wife likes to have old rusty things that don't quite work as well as they used to around the house. But anyway, so she saw this old typewriter and asked my aunt about it. And she said, well, this is a typewriter that I used when I was in nursing school. And it was given to me by my father, my wife's grandfather, when he was working as one of the editors at a newspaper in Charleston, West Virginia. This was the Charleston Gazette. And so there was a bit of kind of a family history to this typewriter that sits, in our living room. But it's interesting when I see this typewriter, it brings back memories of when I was in high school, because in those days, computers were not a thing, at least personal computers. And so when you wrote papers for classes and stuff, and I can remember in high school being advised to take a typing class, because if I was going to go to college, I would need to know how to type in order to survive, to write papers and things like that. And so I achieved 33 words a minute. That was the fastest I could type, which is not very fast. But anyway, but all this, is just kind of a reminder of how much things have changed in terms of the way that we communicate with one another. And it wasn't that uncommon when I was growing up for people to actually write letters to one another and put them in the mail, put them in the post. And letter writing is really in many save. And so it wasn't unusual for someone to save all of their correspondences with other people. And in fact, this was the case for Charles Darwin. Darwin in his lifetime wrote over 17,000 letters that are still in existence today. And in fact, he would make copies of the letters that he wrote, oftentimes to those people that he would correspond with. And there's currently a project underway at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom called the Darwin Correspondence Project, where people are essentially cataloging and commenting on the but this is going to be a wealth of information for people that are interested in studying Darwin, the scientist, Darwin, the person, as well as really looking at the development and, no pun intended, the evolution of his scientific ideas. So a wealth of information that are cataloged in a variety of different ways, including with respect to those people that he would correspond with. And there's a collection of letters that he exchanged with a scientist in the United States by the name of Asa Gray. Asa Gray was a famous botanist at Harvard University, and he was also one of the very first scientists to adopt Darwin's theory of evolution in the United States, and was really an advocate for Darwin's theory. And this is a picture of Asa Gray. And Asa Gray was also interesting in that he was a devout Presbyterian. And he and Darwin had some interesting exchanges. Darwin considered him a friend, had interesting exchanges about some of the theological ideas connected to Darwin's theory. In fact, Asa Gray asked Darwin if he thought that God could have used evolution as the means to create. And in response to that question, Darwin wrote these famous words, "What a book a devil's chaplain might write," on the clumsy, horrible works of nature, the clumsy, low, horrible works of nature. So Darwin wasn't really impressed with that idea. But nevertheless, Asa Gray, again, was a leading advocate of Darwin's theory, and wrote a series of essays, or published a series of essays on Darwin's theory called Darwiniana. And in this, he again advances this idea that God could have used evolution as the means to create. So you might argue that in many respects, Asa Gray was one of the very first people to espouse a position known as theistic evolution. And this is what Asa Gray wrote. Asa Gray was absolutely convinced that there was design in biological systems. And so in one of the essays, he says that there's unmistakable and irresistible indications of design. And yet, he argued that it was through evolutionary means that God affected this design. He writes, God himself is the very last irreducible causal factor, and hence the source of all evolutionary change. Now, as I mentioned, this idea created a bit of controversy, even at that time. Again, as I mentioned, he shared this idea with Darwin, who said that, I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. And so Darwin was, very cautious and careful engaging Asa Gray on this topic, so as not to create offense, it appears, and gives a very political answer. But interestingly enough, in another correspondence with a guy named Joseph Hooker, another close friend of his, he's much more open about his concerns when he writes what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horribly cruel works of nature. And so, the whole point here is that, again, this idea generated a bit of controversy as to, well, what would you expect theologically with respect to the evolutionary mechanism. Is this something that God could use as a means to create? Or is the nature of the evolutionary process really incompatible with how we would understand God as being an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good creator? And interestingly enough, this also ignited a controversy among Asa Gray's friends, who also were scientists and Christians. One of them was the famous geologist Louis Agassiz. And Asa Gray and Agassiz were friends, and Agassiz was deeply troubled by Asa Gray's ideas, arguing that, again, this idea of God employing evolution is something that troubled Asa Gray, troubled Agassiz, who held to the view of that God intervened in particular times in Earth's history to bring about his creative purposes. And so he saw the fossil record as revealing something other than a gradual evolutionary transformation, and held a view that today we might call progressive creation or something like that, progressive creationism. And so, again, this idea of theistic evolution has been long with us. It's not an idea that is new on the scene. But in recent years, a number of evangelical and conservative Christians have entertained the idea of theistic evolution afresh. And in large part, this is motivated by really the sequencing of the human genome and the advent of the science of comparative genomics, where people argue that when you look at the genomes of organisms, you see overwhelming evidence that reflects an evolutionary history of life, and that you see the shared similarities in the genomes that look as if they reflect common descent as opposed to some kind of design, if you will. That the fingerprint for our evolutionary history is written all over our genome. And the argument is that there's overwhelming evidence, again, for an evolutionary history of life, and that as evangelicals and conservative Christians, we have to come to terms with this reality and accept that fact, and incorporate then evolutionary ideas into our theological framework as Christians. In addition to that, the argument is that if we neglect to embrace the evolutionary paradigm, it makes it appear that as Christians, we lack scientific credibility, and it undermines or erodes the credibility of the Christian faith as well. And the argument also is that, look, an added bonus is that we don't have to argue about creation and evolution anymore, that we can just accept this mainstream scientific idea, and that we're no longer at loggerheads with many people in our culture over this particular issue. And so these are, some compelling reasons, obviously, for entertaining the idea that maybe God employed evolution as a means to create. But I hold to a position known as old Earth creationism. I'm in spite of these arguments, I'm not convinced that evolutionary processes are the way that God created, at least that this is the sole means by which God created. I wouldn't consider myself to be strictly an anti-evolutionist, because there's aspects of the evolutionary paradigm I'm quite comfortable with and accept based on scientific evidence. But at the end of the day, I don't feel comfortable calling myself an evolutionary creationist. And some of the reasons why are laid out in the book, Thinking About Evolution. But what I would like to do today is just explain why I don't hold to the evolutionary creationist position. And before I get into that discussion, just want to have a quick, very brief sidebar, and that is, does the idea of theistic evolution make Christianity more credible to skeptics? I hear this all the time, And in my experience, engaging, again, people that are skeptics, that are non-believers in particular, oftentimes, again, this discussion or this idea of God using evolution as a means to create will come up. And in my experience, most people that are non-believers aren't very impressed with that idea. That idea doesn't make Christianity any more attractive to them. They might make comments to the effect that, well, at least you're not rejecting evolution, but that doesn't move them. And part of the reason is, many people adopt this mindset that if God, if evolutionary processes can explain the totality of biology, then, God is not necessary. Why, that God seems superfluous. To add God to the explanation seems superfluous. But these are just a couple of entries from blog articles from well-known evolutionary biologists and atheists that I think are interesting to take a look at in light of this question. And these blog articles were written in June, I believe, of 2010. And they're significant because this is the time frame in which the organization Biologos was launched. This is the organization founded originally by Francis Collins, who was the director of the National Institutes of Health, or who is just retired as the director of the National Institutes of Health. Just recently, he headed up the Human Genome Project. And after finishing that project, founded this organization, again, Biologos, which is a safe space within the church for people to embrace the evolutionary perspective. Francis Collins is an outspoken evangelical Christian, and again, perhaps one of the most prominent scientists who is an evangelical Christian. And so when Biologos was launched, everybody was very interested in what Biologos actually stood for. What was the position that it was actually espousing? And I guess there was a series of articles very early on the historicity of Adam and Eve, where the writers were working through how could you have a historical Adam in light of evolutionary theory, in light of evolutionary ideas. And this is what P.Z. Myers writes. P.Z. Myers is an atheist, outspoken atheist, and I debated P.Z. Myers a number of years ago, by the way, and has an award-winning science blog called Ferengula. And this is what he writes. He says, now I discover that Biologos is also carrying on about the historicity of Adam and Eve with their usual load of waffle and metaphor and vague ways of trying to say it was really true and God made us really, really special anyway. There was no Adam, there was no Eve. We are the products of populations and pools of genes that are briefly instantiated in individuals. And it's a great conceptual error to even fuss, to even fuss over finding the many times great grandparents of us all. It's an even greater error to try to use poorly understood genetics to justify believing in a goofy myth created by people who hadn't even imagined genetics yet. Another entry about that time, a blog entry, is by Jerry Coyne, a well-known evolutionary biologist and atheist at the University of Chicago, who wrote a book called Why Evolution is True. It's a popular level defense of evolutionary theory, and has a blog by that name as well. And he said this kind of desperate apologetics makes believers look pretty bad, at least to those of us who have any respect for truth. It's far simpler to just see Adam and Eve as metaphors, since there's not a scintilla of evidence that they ever existed. But of course, if you start rejecting silly notions because there's no evidence for them, most of Scripture goes down the drain. Now, I'm saying this not to be mean-spirited to people that hold to evolutionary creation or theistic evolution. I'm bringing this up simply to point out that in my experience, many people in the church who are not necessarily scientifically minded see theistic evolution as an attractive approach, because again, it means that we no longer have to go against, quote unquote, the scientific mainstream, that we no longer have to be at odds with many people in our culture over this idea of creation and evolution. And so they find this idea attractive. And yet, in my experience, again, if this is the sole reason why you're entertaining this idea of evolutionary creation, don't be, my exhortation is, don't be deluded into thinking that somehow this makes your apologetic more credible, because it simply doesn't. That's my experience. Now, so then why am I not an evolutionary creationist? Well, there's a number of reasons why that's the case. Some of them are philosophical, some are theological, but there's also some scientific concerns. In fact, I probably hold to my position as an old Earth creationist more so for scientific reasons than actually biblical or theological reasons. And so what I'd like to do tonight is kind of focus on the scientific concerns that I have. And to set the stage for my concerns, I'd like for us just to spend a second or two thinking about this idea by Theodosius Dobzhansky, or this statement by the Russian geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky. In the early 1970s, Dobzhansky wrote an article for a journal called the American Biology Teacher. And in this article, he was encouraging biology teachers to incorporate evolutionary theory much more prominently in their coursework, in the courses that they teach in biology. And he begins the essay with this point, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And maybe you've heard this statement before. And what Dobzhansky is getting at here is that, in a sense, evolutionary theory is, the theory of evolution is, in effect, the organizing principle in biology. That the grand claim is that this mechanism can explain the totality of biology. It can explain the origin of life, the fundamental design of living systems. It can explain the history of life, the biogeographical distribution of living organisms, that everything in biology finds explanation in the theory of evolution. And in fact, as Dobzhansky's pointing out, today many biologists struggle to think about biology in any other terms, that it would be akin to a physicist trying to make sense of the physical world apart from quantum mechanics and general relativity, or a chemist trying to make sense of the world apart from the theories of chemical bonding that are the organizing principle in chemistry. And so this is essentially reflecting the grand claim of the evolutionary paradigm, that everything, again, in biology can be explained through evolutionary mechanisms. And this is really a kind of the basis of many of my scientific concerns, is because I actually see many instances where evolutionary theory, as it's currently framed, fails to be able to account for key transitions in life's history, and I would argue the key transitions in life's history. And then on top of that, there's also predictions made by the evolutionary paradigm that fail to come to pass. But in terms of the unexplained transitions, these are just some of them that currently evolutionary theory can't account for. The origin of life, the origin of what are called eukaryotic cells, the origin of animal body plans, the origin of consciousness, and what we would call the origin of human exceptionalism. And there's others as well that you could probably add to this list. But these are the key transitional events that take place in life's history. And these are the places where evolutionary theory precisely breaks down. For example, let's take a look at the origin of life. The origin of life, I think, is for most people, they would recognize that most in the scientific community are quick to admit that we have no real explanation for how chemical evolutionary processes could generate the very first cells. And the problems go beyond just simply lacking any kind of real evolutionary explanation for how the origin of life could transpire. There are also problematic features connected to the geological record and the fossil record documenting the very first appearance of life on Earth. The fossil record seems to indicate that life originated on Earth easily as far back as 3.8 billion years ago. And there is some tantalizing evidence that indicates that life may have even been present on the Earth as far back as 4 billion years ago. Now, why this is interesting is the Earth, the age dating of the Earth places its age at about 4.5 billion years ago. When we look at the history of the Earth, we recognize that for the first couple of 100 million years, the Earth probably was completely inhospitable to life or to any kind of chemical processes that could contribute to the genesis of the very first cells. Within this window of time, the Earth was experiencing intense impact events, intense bombardment from asteroids and comets, and that these impact events would have largely rendered the Earth a magma ocean. Now, there's some indication that after about 200 million years, the Earth begins to cool down, in large part because these impact events are subsiding, and that there may have been periods where there would have been a solid crust on the Earth, where there would have been oceans on the Earth, but that this window of time very well could have been interrupted with impact events that again would have been frustration events for the origin of life. Regardless of what happens in this window of time between, again, about 4.3 and 4 billion years ago, at about 3.8 billion years ago, there's another wave of impact events that the Earth experiences called the late heavy bombardment, where some kind of gravitational perturbation in the solar system causes asteroids and comets to pummel the inner solar system planets, including the Earth. And these impact events would have volatilized the oceans of the Earth. Some people think it would have melted, again, the rock on the surface of the Earth, turning the Earth again into a magma ocean. And that this would have been, again, devastating for any kind of life that would have been present on the Earth, that it would have interrupted any kind of original life process. There is debate as to what is the extent of the sterilization events. Was that sterilization limited to the surface of the Earth, or did it also extend into the subsurface of the Earth, where you could have had some kind of extremophiles that could have existed deep in the Earth's crust. Bottom line is that this would have been, again, a major disruptor to any kind of chemical evolution. And yet, as soon as the late heavy bombardment subsides, we see evidence that life is present very early in Earth's history. This is microbial life, but there is a good indication that these life forms actually have the capacity for photosynthetic activity, both anoxygenic and oxygenic photosynthesis. And so this is rather remarkable that we see, again, this abrupt appearance of life on Earth. As soon as the Earth is able to support or sustain life, life seems to emerge rather rapidly. Niles Aldrich, a paleontologist, in his book, The Triumph of Evolution and the Failure of Creationism, said in response to this that this is one of the most arresting facts I've ever learned. Life goes back as far in Earth's history as we can possibly trace it. In other words, in the very oldest rocks that stand a chance of showing signs of life, we find those signs, those vestiges of life. Life is intrinsic to the Earth. Bill Schaff, one of the world's leading paleontologists who has expertise in studying the first appearance of life on Earth, who at one time held the record for discovering the oldest fossilized organism. These would have been fossilized rocks that fossilized microorganisms found actually in rock formations in Western Australia, said this: "No one has publicly disagreed with my interpretation of the apex fossils," which is the name given to these fossilized microorganisms. "Privately, some would prefer that I was mistaken, since they and I too would prefer a simpler evolutionary story, one that told us these oldest fossil organisms were capable only of primitive ways of living and that advanced metabolic lifestyles evolved much later. But the evidence seems strong, and what one might prefer shouldn't matter." And so, in other words, this is deeply troubling to the evolutionary framework because the expectation has long been that evolutionary processes to generate the very first cells would have transpired over the course of close to 1 billion years at minimum. And that you would expect very simple life forms capable of simple metabolic activities. And again, the evidence seems to indicate that one of the most advanced metabolic lifestyles, namely photosynthesis, was present on the Earth as soon as life got its start. On top of that, there's not any evidence that we see in the geological record for a prebiotic soup. If life emerges out of a prebiotic soup, we would expect to see a chemical residue in the oldest rocks on Earth that indicated the existence of this prebiotic soup. And in fact, we don't see any evidence for this whatsoever. And we do see a chemical residue in these oldest rocks, but that residue indicates that it was produced through biological activity, not abiological processes. Noam Lahav, in his book Biogenesis, says this: "So far, no geochemical evidence for the existence of a prebiotic soup has been published. Indeed, a number of scientists have challenged the prebiotic soup concept, noting that even if it existed, the concentration of organic building blocks in it would have been too small to be meaningful for prebiotic evolution." So the point here is that what we're looking at is, again, these highly enigmatic results with regard to the origin of life that really raise, in a sense, more questions than provide answers. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we don't really know how life originated, or even if life could have originated through chemical evolution. And the geological evidence only adds to that consternation from a scientific perspective. Now, another key event in life's history that again is highly enigmatic has to do with the origin of eukaryotic cells. The eukaryotic cells, of course, would be cells that have a nucleus. Bacterial cells and archaeal cells consist of, morphologically speaking, a cell wall with no any kind of real internal structure whatsoever. It's essentially a cell wall and a cytoplasm where the DNA exists as a naked circular piece of DNA. Eukaryotic cells are cells that are much larger than bacterial cells and are characterized by internal complexity, where you have membrane-bound structures like the nucleus that houses genetic material that's complex with proteins to form chromosomes. You have networks of internal membrane systems like the smooth and the rough Golgi apparatus. There's organelles like mitochondria and lysosomes and things like that that are membrane bound, where there's a compartmentalization. And so one of the big questions is, how do we explain the origin of eukaryotic cells? And this is a very important transition in life's history that really sets the stage for the emergence of complex multicellular organisms, plants and fungi and animals. And in fact, I'm not going to get into this discussion, but for bioenergetic reasons, you cannot have complex multicellular organisms formed by bacteria and archaea. So if you're going to have complex multicellular life forms on Earth, it's all predicated on the emergence of eukaryotic cells. In the fossil record, it appears as if eukaryotic cells appear about 2 billion years ago, though there is some evidence, chemical evidence in the geological record for compounds produced uniquely by eukaryotic organisms that extend as far back as 2.8 billion years ago. And so it could very well be that eukaryotic cells emerged even earlier than what we glean from the fossil record. When these cells appear, they appear suddenly in an event known as the Eukaryotic Big Bang. Now, there are evolutionary models for how eukaryotic cells could have emerged. One of them which is the leading model, it's called the Endosymbiont Hypothesis. And this model essentially argues that there were these very large bacteria or archaeal cells that served as kind of a host cell that would have engulfed smaller microorganisms that would have become internalized and then formed essentially a symbiotic relationship where that relationship became permanent, so that when the host cell replicated, the endosymbionts in its interior would replicate as well, creating this multi-generational permanent symbiotic relationship where the symbionts are internalized within the host cell. And that over time, these endosymbionts would have undergone some kind of degradation and de-evolved from an independent organism to essentially an organelle. And so the kind of the poster child for the endosymbiont hypothesis would be the mitochondria, which are these small organelles that are roughly the size of a bacterium that perform a number of functions in eukaryotic cells, one of which is they generate energy for the cell to use. And so the thought is that an alpha protein of some sort was engulfed by an archaeal cell, and again underwent this evolutionary degradation that involved a reduction in its genome and the transitioning of some of its genes into the nuclear genome of the host cell, and that over time this led to the emergence of mitochondria within cells, and was a key event probably an early event in the endosymbiont process. Problem is that while there's superficial evidence for this, when you actually dig beneath the surface and think through what would be necessary for this kind of evolutionary transformation to take place, there's all kinds of very serious and significant problems with this theory. And in fact, a few years ago now, two Hungarian biologists, Zakar and Zathmary, wrote a critical review article about the endosymbiont hypothesis with respect to the origin of mitochondria. And they essentially surveyed the scientific literature and some of the ideas that were in play, and basically concluded this way, that the integration of mitochondria was a major transition and a hard one. It poses puzzles so complicated that new theories are still generated 100 years since endosymbiogenesis was first proposed by Konstantin Mierczewski, and 50 years since Lynn Margulis cemented the endosymbiotic origin of mitochondria into evolutionary biology. one would expect that by this time, there's a consensus about the transition, but far from that, even the most fundamental points are still debated. So the point here is that, again, like the origin of life, we really have no real understanding of how the origin of eukaryotic cells originates. Now, another scientific mystery has to do with an event called the Cambrian Explosion, which is an event in life's history that takes place about 520 million years ago, when in a narrow geological window of time, somewhere between 50 to 80% of all the known animal phyla show up. This is a highly enigmatic event in life's history that is still heavily debated today. And in fact, what's interesting is that Darwin himself was actually familiar and well aware of the Cambrian explosion. Darwin writes in Origin of Species, in a chapter that's kind of devoted to objections to his theory. He said there's another and allied difficulty, which is much more serious. I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. To the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods prior to the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer. And in Darwin's time, he speculated, and others have speculated as well, that this challenge essentially reflected the incompleteness of the fossil record, that in those days, paleontology and geology were in their infancy as disciplines. And the feeling was that as we continued to study geological formations and discovered more fossils, that it would make sense of this anomaly that we see in the fossil record. Well, here we are, 160 years, 170 years later, and the Cambrian explosion qualitatively appears to be identical to how Darwin understood it in his day. And the Cambrian explosion is significant because here we see a transition in life's history with respect to animals from what you could argue are colonial aggregates of cells to organisms that have these fully integrated organ systems, where you're looking at, again, complex animal forms. And this is a dramatic transition in life's history that requires not only the means for sexual reproduction, but requires a very complex developmental regime to go from single-celled organisms to, again, multicellular organisms that to show that degree of specialization of different cell types that are organized into tissues, and the tissues organized into organs and into organ systems that are integrated to form the organism in its entirety. That is that's a radical transition in many respects. And there's not really a good evolutionary explanation for that, currently speaking. Doug Irwin and Jim Valentine, in their graduate school textbook called The Cambrian Explosion, write this: one important concern has been whether the microevolutionary patterns commonly studied in modern organisms by evolutionary biologists are sufficient to understand and explain the events of the Cambrian, or whether evolutionary theory needs to be expanded to include a more diverse set of macroevolutionary processes. We strongly hold to the latter position. The move from micro to macro forms a discontinuity. And so what they're getting at here is this, that the mechanisms that Darwin essentially initially proposed, natural selection operating on heritable variation, are in a sense the mechanisms that evolutionary biologists have available to them today, that there's heritable variation, and that variation is operated on not only by natural selection, but sexual selection, and you also have genetic drift. These are the mechanisms that you have. And according to Irwin and Valentine, and their ideas are reflective of a school within evolutionary theory. Their point is that these mechanisms do a wonderful job of explaining microevolution and speciation, but they seem to break down when you try to account for evolutionary transitions that involve the introduction of novelty, chief of which is the Cambrian Explosion, and that they're calling for essentially an expansion of evolutionary theory. This is called the extended evolutionary synthesis as a way to try to account for these kind of transitions, noting that current evolutionary theory is not capable of accounting for those transitions. Then last but not least is something that we might call the sociocultural Big Bang. This is the origin of human exceptionalism. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that there's a growing number of evolutionary anthropologists who actually argue that human beings are exceptional, that modern humans stand apart compared to all other creatures, including creatures in the fossil record like Neanderthals, that we stand apart from them. In that we have essentially certain cognitive capacities that make us unique as human beings, primarily our capacity for symbolism, that we're able to represent the world symbolically, and that we can manipulate those symbols in an open-ended manner to create alternative scenarios. And that those two qualities, along with things like theory of mind, for example, set us apart as human beings from all other creatures. It makes us distinct. It makes us exceptional. And what's intriguing is that this capacity for symbolism seems to show up explosively in the archaeological record, corresponding very closely to the appearance of modern humans. And this is called the sociocultural Big Bang. And one facet of the origin of symbolism is the origin of language. Symbolism manifests in other ways as well, through music and art. But language is the ultimate manifestation of our symbolic capabilities. And the evolutionary origin of language is highly enigmatic. Chris Knight, a paleolinguist, says this: language evolved in no other species than humans, suggesting a deep-going obstacle to its evolution. One possibility is that language simply cannot evolve in a Darwinian world, that is, in a world based ultimately on competition and conflict. The underlying problem may be that the communicative use of language presupposes anomalously high levels of mutual cooperation and trust, levels beyond anything which current Darwinian theory can explain, suggesting a deep-going obstacle to its evolution. And again, what's provocative is that the origin of evolution, the origin of language in the mode and the tempo for that process is not what you'd expect from an evolutionary standpoint. There's not a simple language that evolves into a more complex language, but rather language appears suddenly. And it's again, seems to coincide with the origin of modern humans. It seems to be unique to modern humans, and that the very first language is syntactically as complex as modern day language. Miyagawa, who's a linguist at MIT in the United States, says that the hierarchical complexity found in present day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. In a article published by Ian Tattersall and Noam Chomsky, along with others, they argue this: by this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modification of pre-existing systems under natural selection, but in a single rapid emergent event that built upon those prior systems, but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. And so the point here is that that essentially, in light of Dobzhansky's claim that nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of theory of evolution, key transitions in life's history, again, simply are not understood in evolutionary terms, that evolutionary theory seems to break down minimally at these particular points in life's history. And these, interestingly enough, happen to be those transitions that are considered to be the most significant and most important transitions in life's history. And that these transitions seem to happen abruptly, that they happen rather suddenly in life's history. The origin of life seems to be an abrupt event. The origin of eukaryotic cells is called the Eukaryotic Big Bang, the Cambrian Explosion, the Sociocultural Big Bang. In fact, Eugene Koonin, who's a bioinformaticist at the National Institutes of Health, actually argues that biological innovations in life's history seem to happen abruptly without any intermediate forms documenting that transition, that this seems to be a characteristic pattern, and that in Koonin's analysis, this includes the origin of protein folds, the origin of cells, the origin of bacteria and archaea, the origin of eukaryotes, and then the origin of animal phyla. And so in a sense, what Koonin is arguing is in effect the same thing that we're arguing this evening. And so the point here is that there are two ways that you can look at these failures of evolutionary theory currently, as it's currently conceived, to account for these transitions. Either that these are deep, impenetrable scientific mysteries that maybe we might never solve, but maybe we might solve one day given enough time, and maybe with the development of new ideas in evolutionary theory, or that these challenges are sufficient to question whether evolutionary processes can, in their totality, truly account for everything in biology. And if they can't, is it possible that maybe a creator must have been involved in some capacity, infusing information somehow into biology to support these kinds of transitions? And the fact that you see these abrupt events, to me, suggests that that pattern is consistent with a type of creation event. Now, another set of concerns I also have has to do with failed predictions of the evolutionary paradigm. Excuse me. Because again, the grand claim is that evolutionary theory can account for everything that we see in life's history. And yet there are instances where what we'd expect to see is not what we actually see, when we look at the scientific record. And one example of this would be a phenomena called convergence, which in evolutionary terms refers to what appears to be the repeated independent origin of the same types of biological designs. This phenomena of convergence is widespread. In fact, there was just a paper published a couple of weeks ago claiming that virtually every evolutionary tree that is constructed using morphology, using anatomical features, is probably wrong, and that these evolutionary trees constructed with morphology really don't seem to correspond very well to the geographical distribution of organisms, and that they are in conflict with trees built from using DNA data. And so the argument is that these trees are inherently unreliable, that they're most likely incorrect. And what that also points out is a consequence of this is that convergence is actually a widespread phenomena, is much more widely occurring than what people thought. And so in other words, it looks as if it's rather commonplace for evolutionary processes to generate virtually the same designs over and over again independently. Now, the reason why this is problematic has to do with the very nature of the evolutionary process. It is an unguided, undirected process that is historically contingent, meaning it's predicated on a sequence of chance events. And in fact, in the 6th edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin rejected this idea of convergence, where he says it's incredible that the descendants of two organisms, which had originally differed in a marked manner, should ever afterwards converge so closely as to lead to a near approach to identity throughout their whole organization. And again, what Darwin is looking at is the nature of how he conceived the evolutionary process, which again is predicated on a sequence of chance events. And the late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, in his book Wonderful Life, described the evolutionary process this way: no finale could be specified at the start. None would ever occur a second time in the same way, because any pathway proceeds through thousands of improbable stages. Alter any early event ever so slightly, and without apparent importance at the time, and evolution cascades into radically different channels. And so, in other words, it should be rare that you see convergence in evolutionary history. And that evolution as a rule should not repeat itself. The metaphor that Gould used is that if you could rewind the tape of life and replay it, the outcome would be different every time. And yet again, what we see is convergence is widespread, and that we continually are uncovering new examples of convergence. And as I mentioned again, this recent paper suggests that convergence is even more widespread than anybody actually thought. So, in other words, I think these two categories of scientific concerns are sufficient enough, again, to raise the question, are evolutionary mechanisms truly capable of accounting for everything we see in biology? Now, one quick point, and then I'll turn the floor over to you for discussion. You might ask, well, what about all the evidence for evolution? Because many people would argue, again, these are deep, impenetrable scientific mysteries, but that we're convinced that life must have an evolutionary history because of two features that we see, what are called homologies and the pattern of the fossil record. And so the idea here is that, again, these features are considered to be by many people, again, to be very powerful evidence for evolution, that evolutionary history is the only way to explain the patterns that we see in the fossil record. It's the only way to explain the shared biological features we see among organisms. And this is where the philosophy of science has something interesting to add. And there's a problem known as the underdetermination problem, and that in the philosophy of science. And it's this idea that theories are underdetermined by data. And what's meant by that is that you have a theoretical idea, and that the data on hand may be consistent with that idea, but that data doesn't exclusively point to that particular theoretical construct. In other words, that there could be alternative theories that accommodate the same set of data equally well. And in a sense, because of this underdetermination problem, it's actually possible to argue that the features that many people claim provides, again, undeniable, compelling evidence for an evolutionary history of life could be understood from a design framework or from a creation model framework as equally well. And so, for example, let's take a look at homology, or at the fossil record, where again, the fossil record shows a a progressive series, a progression throughout life's history, where life proceeds from simple forms to more complex forms. Well, that pattern was well known before Darwin's day. And in fact, people like Louis Agassiz, who we met earlier, actually argued that the history of life reflects progressive series of creation events with biological groups originating from the mind of God. And so you could look at the fossil record, and particularly when you see these patterns of abrupt appearances for major transitions, and say, perhaps this history of life on Earth was actually a history of life on Earth that was, again, orchestrated through God's intentional intervention. And that you would see a pattern that would be very similar to what we see currently in the fossil record, or we'd expect to see a pattern very similar. And that this interpretation, which is a kind of a design slash creation model interpretation, has a historical precedence in biology, where prior to Darwin, this is how many biologists saw the fossil record. Homologies, again, today are considered to be the most compelling reason to think that life has an evolutionary history. And homologies refer to shared biological features that occur in organisms that naturally group together. And that many times these shared features superficially are distinct from each other, but fundamentally appear to be reflecting the same design. And so the quintessential example of a homologies would be the forelimb of vertebrates, which has what's called a pentadactyl architecture, which consists of a long bone called the humerus, two bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna, and then there are wrist bones, hand bones, and then the five phalanges, or the five fingers. And that architecture shows up in vertebrates, a dolphin's flipper, a bat's wing, the claw of an anteater, the hoof of a horse, the forelimb and the hands and the feet of monkeys, as an example, are all conform to this pentadactyl architecture. And so the idea is that this design was present in the last shared common ancestor, and that the design essentially was modified as the different evolutionary lineages diverged from that common ancestor, where the forces of evolution would have shaped these core designs into a variety of different functional forms. And so today, this idea of homology is deeply intertwined with the evolutionary paradigm, where the evolutionary process is the explanation for homology, and homology is seen as the evidence for an evolutionary history. And again, this is kind of how this process is conceived in evolutionary terms. But what's interesting is the idea of homologies, that is shared biological features that occur in organisms that naturally group together, was well known prior to Darwin. And one of the scientists who played a key role in elaborating the concept of homology was a scientist by the name of Sir Richard Owen, who prior to Darwin was considered to be the preeminent biologist in the United Kingdom. And he actually developed a theoretical framework to explain homologies from a teleological perspective, from a design-oriented perspective, where he proposed this idea of a vertebrate archetype, where he argued that the archetype was a design that existed in the mind of the creator that was then functionally manifested in the created order. And that for Owen, the archetype represented the ultimate expression of design. Because he marveled at the fact that a creator could develop an archetype that was so versatile that it could be varied and produce a wide range of biological systems with distinct functionality. And so he saw this as the ultimate expression of design. He writes, the satisfaction felt by the rightly constituted mind must ever be great in recognizing the fitness of parts for their appropriate function. But when this fitness is gained, as in the great toe of the foot of man and the ostrich, by a structure which at the same time betokens harmonious concord with the common type, the prescient operations of the one cause of all organization become strikingly manifested to our limited intelligence. In other words, Owen saw shared biological features as reflecting an archetype that again existed in the mind of God. And when Darwin comes along, Darwin actually co-opts Owen's idea of the archetype and evolutionizes it, replacing the archetype with a hypothetical common ancestor. And so the point being that you could see homologies as reflecting common design, not common descent. And so anyway, some of these ideas that I talked about tonight are found in the book Thinking About Evolution. And the book contains a lot more, really presenting kind of a framework for Christians to think critically about evolution, where again, our approach is not to reject evolution or critically or uncritically accept it, but it's rather to think through it and be willing to challenge the scientific mainstream when appropriate. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and let you go ahead and engage in discussion here about some of the ideas that I presented. So anyway, thanks for that. And wow, looks like quite a bit of activity in the chat here already.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Fuzz. That's fantastic. Was there any general conversations that or questions that anyone wants to bring up before we go to the chat? No. Okay.
Yeah, Fuzz. So that left me with a question of how do you put the evolutionary account that you agree with the Genesis account?
Okay, well, I hold to an older creationist position, and so again, as an older creationist, I would say with regard to biological origins, I think that there are places where a creator intervenes in a direct way, where that intervention could be described as an event more so than a process. But I also think that there's ample evidence for evolutionary processes. So I envision a creator, again, intervening in a direct way at certain points in life's history, creating essentially archetypical designs. This would be particularly true when we see instances of biological innovation in life's history. And then once those designs are in place, evolutionary processes will essentially modify those designs, right? Fine-tune those designs in response to, changes that are taking place in the environment. So, I kind of hold to a hybrid position. When I look at Genesis 1, I take the view that Genesis 1 is a historical description of God's creative activity. So I don't see Genesis 1 as mythical or allegorical. I see it as a literal historical description of God's creative activity, where I would view the days in Genesis 1 as referring to periods of time, and that the different days of creation are, in a sense, kind of like highlights of God's creative activity. So that's kind of how I would look at it, is a sequential presentation of highlights of God's creative activity, where I see Genesis 1 as being historical, but I also see it as much more than historical as well. It's obviously written in the context of the ancient Near East. And I think part of Genesis 1's function is to serve as kind of a polemic and an apologetic against the ideas of the ancient Near East. And so many of the highlights that are shown throughout the creation week that's described in Genesis 1 would be in reference to deities that were being worshipped in the ancient Near East, with the point being that God, the one true God, created these things that you are worshiping as gods, and they are not to be worshipped, but rather the one true creator is to be worshipped. So I think that's part of what is going into the selection in some of the descriptions that you see in the different days of creation. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, without getting into a lot of details.
Thanks. That's really clear. Just the one thing though that raises in my mind, is there a risk of a God of the gaps in some ways with that view?
Great question. The way I presented things tonight, I think you could argue that it's somewhat of a God of the gaps approach, because we're saying, hey, look, we don't really have explanations here, so therefore, it's possible that maybe God is intervening at that point. And so the way I presented it tonight, I think my presentation could be susceptible to that God of the gaps critique. But in the larger picture, in terms of the work that I've done, like, for example, let's use the origin of life, because I've spent a lot of time working on the origin of life problem. Part of what we have pointed out is, again, what I see to be intractable problems with chemical evolution, but we've also presented, in several books, actually arguments for design. So we also are highlighting the evidence that seems to suggest the work of a mind. So in my book, The Cell's Design, I kind of present a revitalized watchmaker argument, where I argue that the designs that you see in biochemistry show this eerie similarity to the designs that we would produce as human engineers. In Creating Life in the Lab, I talk about how work in synthetic biology and the attempts to create protocells, for example, really highlight the necessary role that intelligent agency must play. So it's kind of like an empirical argument for design. What does it take to make a cell? And is this something that, again, makes more sense from a design standpoint, or from a, quote unquote, a evolutionary standpoint? And then I've got another book recently out called Fit for a Purpose, where I talk about kind of the concept of biochemical fine-tuning. So we in terms of our overall, the overall case that we're making, it's not just simply, critiquing the evolutionary model, but it's trying to present, a positive arguments. So, for example, in what I presented tonight, I didn't give a lot of emphasis to this, but again, the fact that we're seeing these abrupt appearances that correspond to innovations in life's history, could be taken as a signature for God's intervention, right? So that would be positive evidence that goes beyond just simply saying evolution can't explain it. Or with convergence, again, this is not something I would maintain that you would expect from an evolutionary framework, but it also is the type of thing I would expect from a design framework. That is, human designers often reuse the same design over and over again in different contexts. So you could see that as not only problematic for a strict evolutionary explanation, but also is consistent with, again, how designers work. So appreciate your point, but I think in totality, we're not making a God of the gaps argument, but I could see why you would say that here.
I wasn't a statement. It was just a clarifying question. I wasn't. It wasn't an accusation or anything. Thank you.
Well, I mean, sorry to, it's a really important point that you made up, even if it was a clarifying question, because, I think that one of the things we really want to try to avoid is making a God of the gaps argument, right? I think, that if we're going to make a case for a creator, it really needs to be built on kind of positive arguments, not negative arguments. Right.
Okay. Did you want to clarify anything else from that one? No?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks.
All right. What is the difference between evolutionary creation and progressive creation? I think Kevin put that up. Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question.
Can I just speak to it? Yeah, you may have already explained this, but and I may not have picked it up. But what is the difference between evolutionary creation and progressive creation, and where do you stand relative to those?
Yeah, and evolutionary creation would be this idea that God employs, again, evolutionary mechanisms exclusively to bring about his creative purposes. And that when you look at the fossil record, that progression of life that you see is essentially reflecting, again, an evolutionary history of life where God is, again, responsible for life's history, but is working, again, through the evolutionary process. A progressive creationist would say there is indeed a progression of life, that we see in the fossil record. So they would agree, with evolutionary creationists on that point. But an older Earth creationist / progressive creationist would say, similar to Louis Agassiz, that progression of life was divinely orchestrated. So again, this is a similar point to evolutionary creationists. It's just that God is intervening through the evolutionary process and also outside of the evolutionary process at key points in life's history. So, like, for example, with the origin of life, I would see that as being a point where there's like a fiat command that is responsible for creating life, right? Or at the origin of eukaryotic cells, that it's a fiat command. But it's more of a direct intervention at a singular point in time. I don't know. Does that make any difference? I mean,
you distinguish between the two categories. I was in a little. How does evolutionary creation differ from theistic evolution? And could you say where you stand?
Yeah. Theistic evolution and evolutionary creation is essentially the same concept. One of the things that BioLogos has done is to instead of referring to themselves as theistic evolutionists, they like to call themselves evolutionary creationists, where they're saying, making the point that they believe in creation just as much as an old Earth or a young Earth creationist. It's just that they would argue that God is employing evolution as the means to create. So,
and where do you?
So it's just a rebranding essentially of the concept, because theistic evolution has so much baggage with it. So it's kind of rebranding the concept.
So are you on the progressive side of the debate?
Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to evade that. Yeah, I tend to be on the progressive side. So again, I'm not an anti-evolutionist, but I'm not, I don't embrace everything in evolutionary theory. So I'm kind of somewhere in between.
What evolutionary part of it would you embrace or would you accept then?
Well, I mean, for example, I obviously, very microevolution or variation that happens within a species, I'm, completely comfortable with. I think evolutionary mechanisms can generate new species, so speciation. I think you might be able to explain, the history of life and the diversity of life through the level of genus and family through evolutionary means. When you start getting to to orders and classes and phyla, that's where that's where I would probably begin to look for God's intervention at that point. So I'm not quite sure where I would exactly draw the line at this point, but there do seem to be, for example, places where evolutionary theory really does seem to break down. And, one of the big problems in evolutionary theory today is how do you explain the origin of biological novelty? That's a real serious challenge, is accounting for biological novelty. And again, what the concern is that the mechanisms that we have identified do a wonderful job of explaining speciation, but they seem to break down when you're looking at how do you explain the generation of new biological systems. And so there are people that are calling for what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis, where they're arguing that evolutionary theory needs to be expanded and to introduce other mechanisms beyond, the mechanisms that are currently in play if we're ever going to explain these key transitions. And in fact, if you look at the origin of eukaryotic cells, that's an example of appealing to a very different kind of evolutionary mechanisms, in this case, symbiogenesis, to explain the origin of eukaryotic cells. So that's the type of thing that would be part of the extended evolutionary synthesis. I mean, unfortunately, that approach is yet to, in my mind, to produce a satisfying explanation for the origin of eukaryotic cells.
Okay, great. Tom, I know, was this from you, Kevin? Surely enough, evolutionary creationism is one possible way of explaining reality, and with a zero chance of being essentially correct?
No, that was not my question. Somebody else.
And with a greater than zero chance of
Greater than zero, sorry. Yes.
Of being, somewhat correct. Like, I mean, do you have a pathological sort of hatred of evolutionary creationism, or because it's possible, right? I mean,
oh yeah, of course it is possible. The fact of the matter is, every model that people present, and I'm thinking in very broad terms now: young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, evolutionary creationism. These all have, when we think about things scientifically, philosophically, and biblically or theologically, they all have strengths, they all have limitations, right? And going back to the earlier question, the difference between evolutionary creation and progressive creation, part of the discussion really is the mode of divine action. When God is affecting evolutionary changes, what is that mode of divine action? And so, I don't have any kind of, as you said, pathological hatred of evolution or anything like that. It's just, to me, it's what model seems to account for the data to the greatest degree. When you do look at homologies and you look at the nature of the fossil record, I mean, that's not unreasonable to look at that and say, well, this seems to really be indicating an evolutionary history to life. But then on the other hand, you see places where, again, evolutionary theory doesn't seem to be sufficient. And there's not anything that's coming to the table that seems to be, to solve any of these problems, and then you couple that with the fact that there's this incredible evidence for design that we see in biochemistry and biology. So I think it's reasonable in light of that to say, well, maybe, the best model is some kind of design model or some kind of creation model. Everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses, and it really becomes, what is at the end of the day, the model that best explains as much of the data as possible.
Yeah, and the reason for that question, the clarification was just, at the end of the day, apologetically, do we do better by having a range of options for interpreting both reality and genesis, or are we better off arguing a narrow position as a layman, it almost feels like we're better off having a range of options for explaining, and one of them is no doubt, or one of them may be a variation, or maybe we've got them all wrong. I don't know, but you know, if God was there and God did it, and we have a range of explanations for reality and what God did, seems like a good thing apologetically.
Yeah, you know, I'm highly sympathetic to that point. You know, I think it's you know, particularly within the church, and particularly for young people in the church, I think it's very important that they understand that there's a range of options available to them. And to me, I think one of the big failures, at least I'll speak to my experience in America, one of the big failures is that these issues become so contentious. I think it's great to debate with one another about what is the best model, you know, within the church. But these debates become so divisive and contentious that many church leaders don't want these issues discussed in the church, because it's just another, you know, issue that's going to divide the congregation. And so the net effect is that young people in the church are not exposed to ideas. And I think the best thing that we can do to young people is to lay out different models for them. But at the same time, I think it's important for people to have convictions and to hold to those convictions and to defend those convictions. That it's just that these conversations can happen in a way that's unifying or in a way that's divisive. And it's really our responsibility to try to ensure that in the midst of these debates and differences, that we're looking for ways to unify, not divide, and that we don't demonize you know, people that hold differing views from ours. But at the same time, I think that we also need to recognize that if we're involved in evangelism, using apologetics for the purpose of evangelism, in my experience, I have just not seen a lot of people that are non-believers, that are skeptics, non-Christians, however you want to you know, categorize those people that would, you know, reject the Christian faith in some way, shape, or form. A lot of them who are scientifically minded are not impressed with this idea of God using evolution as a way to create. I find that saying that as an option, you may find a point of common ground with a non-believer, but it doesn't do anything to really get them to entertain the idea that maybe there is a creator. I can't tell you how many people I know who are in the life sciences who would say, well, that's an interesting idea, but, you know, again, I don't see God as necessary if evolution can explain everything. And so I think in that situation, it's important to try to dislodge people a bit from that position, where you try to point out that, wait a minute, there actually are places where, you know, a strictly materialistic explanation doesn't seem to be able to account for, you know, some of these features. And so if I'm engaging a non-believer, the place I would go to would be the origin of life question. That's where I would camp, because everybody pretty much agrees that we don't know how life originates through chemical evolution. And there we have a chance with, you know, the nature of biochemical systems to make very strong design arguments in combination with that. So, so it really depends on what is it you're trying to accomplish with your apologetic. Is it really to give, you know, confidence to believers, which is a perfectly reasonable use of apologetics, or is it to try to engage a non-believer? And I think you're better off engaging a non-believer as being very narrow and specific.
Yeah, so he's basically saying that you see the invisible gardener parable being very powerful to those people for
right.
For evolutionary creationism. So okay,
Right.
thank you. That's
Yeah,
great.
no, great points.
What are the how do you pronounce that? Eukaryotic cells?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah. So
silly
yeah.
question.
So
It's
yeah.
probably a silly question. My understanding is that eukaryotic cells are single-cell organisms, and if that is correct, then just move on.
Single cell organisms, are they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, there are two fundamentally different cell types that we see in biology: prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are the types of cells that make up bacteria and archaea. They're smaller cells, typically 1 to 2 microns in diameter. They have a cell wall. There's no real internal structure. Eukaryotic cells tend to be much larger, anywhere from 30 microns to a couple of hundred microns. And they're characterized by internal complexity, where they have these membrane-bound compartments, the nucleus, things like the endoplasmic reticulum, different organelles. So this would be what you typically would see in a biology textbook as a cell. And these cells eukaryotic cells there are some single-celled organisms that are eukaryotic. Yeast is an example. And then the basis for multicellular organisms like fungi, plants, and animals are eukaryotic cells. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah. Okay. The next one, Kevin, was a main problem is that these discussions are way over lay people's heads, and so they just choose whom to believe. Did you want to elaborate on that, Kevin?
I have in subsequent questions that it seems that the devil's in the detail, and so people get dogmatic based on high-level concepts, and it all gets lost.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to that point. And so the challenge is, how do you, help lay people? And ultimately, I think if you are operating as a lay person, you're going to sometimes decide the position that you hold based on who you trust, right? More so than really what the evidence seems to indicate. So I am sympathetic to that point. And in fact, the devil is in the details. I very much appreciate that. For example, I just wrote a book and just had a book published called Fit for a Purpose. And the book is about the question, does the anthropic principle apply to biochemistry? And the anthropic principle has to do with kind of like the fine-tuning of the constants of the universe. And in order to make that argument, it's a highly technical book, and it has to be. And so that book isn't really for everybody. That book isn't really for lay people. It's really designed for trying to, engage specialists who, are non-believers. And so that's the point of that book, right? And so it's challenging, right? How do you present concepts, and how do you, with sufficient rigor that lay people can, participate in making informed decisions about what particular view they're going to hold, but ultimately, it's all about the details. And a lot of times, again, the idea of the Endosymbionic Hypothesis, I can always tell when I'm speaking at a university event, if a student asking a question is a biology major, because biology majors will inevitably ask about the Endosymbiont Hypothesis, I find, and nobody else in the audience knows what's going on. But that's an example where superficially the evidence seems really strong in support of an evolutionary origin of eukaryotic cells. It's not until you start asking some of the detailed questions that you suddenly see the flaws of that idea being made bare. And so it's very hard for someone in my position to explain to a layperson why this doesn't work, right? And but for somebody who's a biologist, that's a very important conversation to have. So I'm sympathetic to that point. I don't have any. I've been doing this for over 2 decades. I don't know that I've got any better insight than you on how to necessarily solve this problem.
All right, Tom, would you like to ask the next one about the macroevolutionary issue?
Yeah, when you talk, if I understood that right, and this was related to morphology, I was listening. I listened very skeptically to a lot of the Discovery Institute stuff, but some of it is fascinating, and it seems to be the same. You're saying that you can get microevolution, but I've heard Stephen Meyer talk about how impossible it is to actually get new body plans and novelty. And I think I heard you say that words. So is this the same concept, or am I getting things confused?
Yeah, it's the same concept, and my argument is really based on the work of evolutionary biologists that are experts in these areas. So it's not, it's not just simply my assessment, right? But it's really, this seems to be for people that are working as experts in this area. How do you explain the origin of body plans? It seems to be highly enigmatic, right? So and those people working on those problems in many instances are deeply committed to the idea that there will be evolutionary explanations for this. So I would share Steve Meyer's critique, or the concerns I would raise would be similar to Steve Meyer's, but I would point out that it's not something that Steve Myers and I concocted, but rather it's a bona fide issue.
Okay. Yeah, this was from me. Was there a period in Earth's life history wherein one group of dinosaurs was wiped out from the Earth and another group of fully formed dinosaurs appears relatively quickly? I'd heard that although there was a few million years in between, apparently there isn't an evolutionary explanation for this.
Yeah, and I don't know that I've got enough understanding of the natural history of dinosaurs to speak authoritatively on this. But there does seem to be a very interesting pattern, in life's history, is that when you do see extinction events that take place, mass extinction events, many times, well, when you see mass extinction events, what ends up happening is that there's very rapid recovery of ecosystems afterwards. And in conjunction with that recovery, there seems to be, again, the appearance of new types of organisms that take place. And so it's not a mass extinction where there's this slow, gradual recovery, where the diversity increases gradually over time. It just seems as if these new ecosystems show up almost immediately after the other, ecosystems disappear. And it's very interesting to see plots of mass extinctions laid on top of plots of mass originations, where they almost look like they're just slightly offset from each other by really tens of millions of years. So, and I think this may also be the case when you go from Jurassic to Triassic to Cretaceous dinosaurs. But I don't know that for certain. I couldn't point you to a scientific paper off the top of my head that would support that. But that's the sense that I get.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't be more detailed. I'm sorry.
That's fine, Fuzz. Yeah. Another one from you, Tom, about the eye.
Yeah. So this is again regarding morphology and convergence, and I did start listening to Stars, Cells, and God on the where I think you were talking about this one as well with you, but I've heard biologists refer to the fact that, oh, well, that's modification and then sorry, and I've got the term has just gone out of my head, but basically change and then descent, right?
Yeah. This idea of convergence is interesting because again, it seems to be a pattern that we see in life's history. And, again, if you look at the analysis that people like Stephen Jay Gould has published, and there's other people who have come along after him and who've made arguments that it really does look like the evolutionary process is historically contingent, then again, you wouldn't expect something like as complex as the eye to evolve independently multiple times. And the example of convergence there would be the eyes that you see in octopi versus the vertebrate eye, where there are some differences between those two eyes, but both are camera eyes that look like they independently emerged, which again is incredibly remarkable. Another example that you see like that would be the visual system in the chameleon and the sand lance, which is a fish, where the visual system, not just simply the eye, but the entire visual system is virtually indistinguishable in those two organisms. That looks as if it has an independent, independent origin. And in fact, the people that made that discovery were just stunned by the fact that this type of system would have emerged through evolutionary means independently. Now, I mean, the eye, there are different types of eyes in biology that have emerged independently, but that to me would not be what I would think of as convergence. I would say convergence would be if these systems emerged and they are, identical or nearly identical systems. That to me would be what I would expect that we wouldn't see. But there are different ways to interpret this. One would be that, hey, maybe these systems are, maybe natural selection is channeling evolutionary processes to the same endpoint because the environmental influences are the same, and that's forcing the forces of natural selection are the same. That's forcing evolution down the same pathway. I don't find that to be very compelling because, in a sense, there's a historically contingent element to natural selection too. So, so people like, I'm drawing a blank on this guy's name now. I got the book on my shelf right behind me. I should go look at Richard Lewinton. Richard Lewinton basically argues that from organisms as you go from generation to generation with organisms, those organisms are experiencing very different selective environments. And that natural selection is not this consistent force that operates across generations, but rather is distinct for each generation. So his argument would be like if you have, redwood trees that are grown in a virgin meadow, these very massive, large trees, that the seedlings that come from come from those trees are going to be living in an environment that's not an open meadow, but an environment where there's a lot of shade because of the trees that are there previous to them. And so that you don't have this consistent influence of natural selection. So there's a historically contingent element, not only to the genetic changes that take place in an organism, but to the selective environment as well. And so to say that natural selection is going to funnel things to the same endpoint doesn't seem to me to be very compelling. There's a real interesting idea that is held by a minority of evolutionary biologists, and this is an idea called structuralism. And the idea here is that that natural selection isn't determining evolutionary outcomes, but evolutionary outcomes have been predetermined by the very nature of the universe itself, by the laws of nature itself. And so the idea here is that that the I is essentially an outworking of the constraints of the laws of nature, where there's only certain endpoints that are actually possible, and that evolution is going to go to those endpoints, not because natural selection drove it there through a historically contingent process, but because those endpoints were predetermined. And it's a really interesting idea, and the evidence that people give for that model of evolution, which is not your grandfather's version of evolution, it's a radically different idea, is convergence. So people like Simon Conway Morse, George McGee are arguing for that kind of evolutionary process. And it's interesting because that process generally speaking, makes evolutionary biologists uncomfortable because it's highly teleological. So Conway Morse's point is that you've got these seemingly predetermined endpoints that evolution hits upon over and over and over again, and that these are, the just right biological features that are highly optimized systems, and that his argument is there's something that is driving evolution to predetermined endpoints. And so that's another way to interpret convergence. And so to me, this is interesting because then what it's saying is convergence is in a sense suggesting that there's a teleology in biology, whether you understand that teleology is God is intervening to create the same designs over and over again, or that God has rigged things from the very get-go so that only certain outcomes are happening. Either way, you're looking at something that's highly teleological. And so this is a place where through structuralism, I think this idea of evolutionary creation and progressive creation start to really bridge to one another, if that makes any sense.
It does. That makes perfect sense. And it explains what I was listening to, because I was listening to a couple of, I've listened to a number of information and physicists, and what they're trying to do is to solve the origin of life problem using information models that are actually going from basically that will naturally tend towards complexity. So what you're saying there makes perfect sense with structuralism. That could actually explain why they were arguing for convergence being the multiple appearance of the eye being a factor for evolution and for natural selection. Thanks. Right. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's kind of a simple, analogy that might make sense. Suppose, there's a valley, right? And at the lowest point in the valley, I dig a hole that perfectly fits, a ball, right? And so if I can place that ball in that hole, and that's, I determined that ball should be in that particular position. Now I could also create some kind of, apparatus where I could drop the ball at any location at a high point, leading down to the valley, so that ball rolls inevitably towards that low point and will settle exactly there. And so in both cases, I intended for that ball to be where it wound up. It's just that the process by which that ball arrived at that location is either through my direct activity or indirectly through an apparatus that I built so that it would always go to that point. And so structuralism would be the apparatus, whereas, a creationist / design position would be, well, somebody placing that ball there intentionally. Either way, they both are telling you that there's a purpose, right? That things have been predetermined, that there's a teleology to why that ball is where it's at. Whereas natural evolution by natural selection would just simply say the ball rolled, on its own, the ball started to roll down the hill and it just wound up where it wound up. It may not even wind up at the low point, right? And if I drop the ball down the hill again, it's going to wind up in a different location. or if I start in different spots and let it roll down the hill, it's going to wind up again in different spots. So that's how those three different approaches would see, the placement of the ball, right? Is it just simply what chance has wrought, or is it actually something that's predetermined in some way?
And if it was just chance, you wouldn't expect the ball to be in the same spot.
Right. The more I'm very intrigued with the idea of structuralism. And to me, again, it's one of these ideas that I think can kind of bridge a number of different positions, like old Earth creation, evolutionary creation, in a way that really reintroduces teleology, into biology in an intriguing way, right? And what I'm beginning to realize is that if you start thinking about things through a structuralist mindset, as you're pointing out, even like with regard to the origin of life problem, you might actually wind up with some intriguing ideas that are highly teleological, right? And to me, that if there's an issue I have with evolution, as it's presented in the mainstream, it's that it's anti-teleological. That if as soon as you start introducing the idea of teleology into evolution, it makes many people that are evolutionary biologists deeply uncomfortable. There's a strong reaction against that, right?
Well,
and so to me, that philosophically, that's my issue with evolution, is that the way it's conceived today is that there's no room for any kind of purpose in life's history. It's all just happenstance. It's all, just what chance wrought, and that to me is really why I think a lot of Christians are uncomfortable with evolution. And it's intriguing if there are ways to introduce teleology into evolution, then I think it just suddenly becomes an idea that becomes much more compatible to Christians, I think, who are, who are concerned about, undermining God as creator, that undermining the concept of God as creator.
Just need to comment there. You're so right. Yeah. You didn't by chance catch Richard Dawkins talking to Francis Collins on Unbelievable a couple of weeks ago?
I knew that conversation happened, but I haven't had a chance to watch it yet.
Oh, to your very point here, Dawkins regards any introduction of God or teleology into evolution as a betrayal. He uses that word. He uses that word 3 or 4 times, very, very emotively. And to your very point here, it's the counter to what you're saying. So I think you might find it very interesting.
All right. Paul, you've got a question about the unique characteristics of humans and how they're passed on and inherited. Do you want to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, for sure. But first of all, I'd just like to say it's been great to hear you talk about these topics, Dr. Rana. And it just amazes me the amount of knowledge that you pass on through these conversations. It's absolutely great. But having talked about the history and the evolution of Earth over the billions of years, and whether it's through evolutionary process or whether it's through progressive design events of God, we ultimately arrive at Genesis 1, 26-27, where God creates man in his likeness. So it's about the imago Dei. And then my question is the characteristics that make us God-like. First, did it become part of our DNA? Is there any genetic code for Imago Dei? And if not, how are these characteristics passed on from Adam to the descendants? Does God endow each new child with these characteristics at conception or during embryonic development?
What a question. Okay, so you just asked a question that would take a coursework, but no, excellent. Let me see if I can try to encapsulate. I mean, really great, because in a sense, what you're getting at is what does Scripture mean when we talk about the image of God? And Scripture, unfortunately, isn't highly clear as to what the image of God is. There are passages that teach that human beings bear God's image. Those are not a lot of passages, but they're very important passages. There are passages that tell us that if we want to understand the true image of God, we look to the person of Christ. And there are passages that speak about kind of the image of God as being the ideal that we are to strive for through the transformative power of the Holy Spirit to attain, right? So those are the three types of passages that kind of speak about the image of God. Now, theologians debate as to what exactly does the image of God mean. There are some who hold to the view called the resemblance view, or sometimes it's called the substantive view or the structural view of the image of God, which says that the image of God are certain attributes that we have as human beings that we share with God, though it's an imperfect resemblance, but we do share these with God. And so this would typically be things like our capacity for moral understanding, our technical inventiveness, creativity, rational thought, our relational capacities, the kind of a religious sense or a spiritual sense. So that would be one particular view. That view has actually traditionally been the main view in church history, but more recently, evangelical and conservative Christians have argued that the image of God actually has to do with our responsibilities. So this would be the representative view or the functional view, where the people that hold this view are looking at Genesis 1, 26 to 31, and then the implications of Genesis 2 and Psalm 8, for example, saying that really the image of God refers to a responsibility that we've been given to be stewards of the planet, to exercise dominion over the creation, to bring the earth under our control. And then the other view is the relational view, that the image of God refers to our unique relational capacities, or in our relationship uniquely with the Creator. These three views are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, I hold to the substantive view or the resemblance view, because I think if you're talking about, again, the idea that we are to be transformed into the true image of God, that transformation is involving attributes that we display. And so I think thinking of the image of God in structuralist terms or substantive terms or resemblance terms makes the most sense. And in fact, that view subsumes the other two views, in the sense that if we're going to serve certain functions uniquely as human beings, we have to have certain capacities to do that distinguish us from other creatures. And then likewise with the relational view, to enter into, relations with God, with other people, again, that are unique, because only human beings bear God's image, then there has to be certain qualities that we have that are unique to us. So I think you wind up at the substantive view, regardless of the particular specifics that you hold. Now, if that's the case, then it means that there are certain capabilities that we uniquely have as human beings. And of course, we have to keep in mind that as a human person, we are both, there's a material aspect to our nature and an immaterial aspect to our nature. And what's intriguing to me is that evolutionary anthropologists are recognizing that modern humans seem to be unique, seem to stand apart. And that uniqueness is connected to our biology. For example, if you compare the skull of humans with Neanderthals, our skull is globular and our face is flat, our chin is retracted. Neanderthals have an elongated skull. They have a chin that juts outward. And this actually has profound differences on the brain shape, where the brain of humans has an expanded parietal lobe, which in expansions in certain areas of the frontal lobe that actually are believed to impart to us cognitive superiority compared to Neanderthals. At least that's one interpretation. We also see some genetic differences between humans and Neanderthals that suggest differences in genes that are involved in neurological development, not only in terms of the DNA sequence, but also how those genes seem to be differentially expressed. We also see developmental differences in the brain and the skull between humans and Neanderthals. It doesn't look like Neanderthals went through a period of adolescence where humans do, and that has implications for brain development. Now, it's also interesting that when we look at the archaeological record, by and large, it seems that humans uniquely are creating objects that display symbolic capacities, that we're creating symbolic artifacts. And the origin of that symbolism seems to coincide roughly with the appearance in the fossil record of humans with globular skulls, right? And so that does, and what seems to make us unique, as I mentioned earlier, is our capacity for symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could argue that our capacity for symbolism is ultimately the quality that makes our moral understanding possible, our technical inventiveness and creativity possible, rational thought possible, right? It allows for us to enter into very sophisticated relationships with one another. So it's interesting that maybe the science is actually providing legitimacy to this idea of human uniqueness and exceptionalism in a way that aligns with the image of God. So I would say that the image of God is in part physical, and of course that means that would be inherited, that would be heritable. But I also think that there is an immaterial aspect, to the image of God. So the way I see it is a very crude analogy, is a hardware-software analogy, where if you think of our immaterial aspect as as software and our brains as the hardware, we have hardware that is designed to operate, the software that makes us spiritual beings in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And this also means that if someone has hardware that's damaged, that even though that software is present, it's not going to be operational, right? That it's not going to be expressed. And so that's, how I would see it, is that now the question is to when, there's also this issue of ensoulment, which when does the immaterial aspect of our nature appear? So there's one model called traducianism, which is arguing that there's a spiritual inheritance that's analogous to our physical inheritance, that when the mother and father, come together and have a child, that child is getting not only a physical inheritance from them, but also a spiritual inheritance. And so the image of God kind of forms as the melding of the two parents come together during the reproductive process. And so that, in that sense, then the image of God would be continuous, from the point of conception, right? And ensoulment would happen in that way. There's another view called creationism, which says that God is directly intervening to create the soul in each individual
Each
embryo.
individual. Yeah.
And there's biblical support for both views, by the way. And so, yeah, so so I don't know that I've got a definitive answer. I tend to lean towards I tend to lean towards a creationist view, but not entirely. But it's interesting because, one of the questions that oftentimes comes up is that, well, if humans and Neanderthals interbred, then will the human Neanderthal hybrid have the image of God? And as I've wrestled through this question, I've come to, this is the way I've resolved that very tricky problem, and that is that the hybrid would have the image of God. And there's two ways to think about this. From a Traducian perspective, is that the image of God isn't really divisible, right? It's either there or it's not there. And so if one of the parents is an image bearer, then their offspring is going to bear the image of God, right? Because from a creation perspective, you could say, well, maybe God would honor the fact that one of the parents was indeed a human and could intervene to introduce the image of God into that person. So, so hopefully that helps.
Yes. No, absolutely.
But we could spend hours and hours going through each one of those points, and very fast. But to me, the image of God idea is such a critical idea, because it's ultimately the foundation of Christian ethics.
Yes.
Right? It's the foundation for our capacity to enter into a relationship with God. So it's the foundation of the gospel in many respects. And so it's really important, I think today, particularly, to be able to, as Christians, to defend the image of God concept in a secular world that it tends to elevate, animals and even AI systems to the status of personhood, and at the same time seems to denigrate human beings to being not much more than animals. Excuse me.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned the hybrid nature, if Neanderthals and humans mated, and the possibility that the hybrid may inherit the image of God, I had another question. What does this mean for the scientists who today are creating human monkey hybrids? I read in an article recently from Nature, volume 592, the 22nd of April, 2021. Scientists have injected monkey embryos with human stem cells and observed the embryos developing for 19 days. Now, they say the objective of this research is to better test drugs and grow human organs for transplant. But from a Christian worldview, how ethical is this?
Yeah.
Particularly if we're saying there's some possible inheritance of God.
Christians, in terms of thinking through some very complex issues. And, on one hand, I am glad to see this kind of work taking place, because it's at least it's a implicit admission that there's something sacred, or at least something unusual about a human embryo, that, that we can do things with animal-human hybrids that we can't do with human embryos, which allows us to gain
Yeah.
knowledge that may actually benefit human beings. So, the idea of doing comparable experiments on human embryos, which some scientists advocate for,
Yeah.
to me is morally repugnant. So this is a way to sort of have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. But, of course, the limitation of this is that ultimately those embryos are not going to survive much beyond, because of incompatibility, or at least concerns with well, I check that. I'm thinking about different kinds of hybrids. Sorry. These are hybrids that are made by taking an egg cell from one creature and a sperm cell from another. Like you might take a human egg cell and then fertilize it with the sperm from another organism to create embryos that are hybrids. But here you're taking stem cells from humans and you're implanting them into the monkey, and they're developing so that they're going to have a mosaic of cells, right? Some from the monkey, some from the human. And the hope is that you might be able to humanize, the monkey in some way. And people have also done experiments where they've created these hybrids, or these chimeras, as they're called, right? By implanting human stem cells like into the brains of mice and rats in the lab. And so there's concerns that you're creating these humanized animals, which, may develop some capacity for enhanced sentience and self-awareness. And so I don't think that is likely to happen. But, it's not an open and shut case.
No.
And so it poses very interesting questions about, if you think of personhood as equating to sentience, then you would say, well, maybe these lab animals that have these human cells, particularly human brain cells, and if they have enhanced cognition, maybe they should be granted suddenly human rights, right? So these are the types of debates that are taking place. So to me, I think doing these experiments from a Christian perspective in a limited capacity, if there's decent reasons to do that work, is fine. If you can contain the human cells to away from the brain, I would be much more comfortable with the work. I mean, this might be a way to make animals that have humanized organs that could serve as a source of organs for organ transplant. So there's potential good that can come from this technology. It's just, very messy, and, some very interesting concerns. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't know that there is a Christian perspective on how we should think about this work. I think there are Christian perspectives that are probably none of which are very well developed and really very well informed, because this is such new stuff.
Yes.
And we don't really know what the extent of the modifications actually is to these organisms, to these animals, right? And but I don't know that by implanting stem cells into another, from humans into another animal, would necessarily give that animal the image of God.
Okay.
But you might enhance its cognition, right? And this also leads to all kinds of animal rights questions, animal welfare questions that, as Christians, I think we should be concerned with as well, right? Because we're not to abuse animals. So, anyway, great question. Again, that's something that we could spend hours talking about.
Right. But thank you for your input, your comments. It's great. Yeah.
Well, before we finish, has anyone got any more questions? Trevor, you've been very quiet. Have you got any questions that you'd like to ask? No?
No.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Trevor. Yeah. No, you're not.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
You can?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm recovering from an eye operation today, so a little bit under the weather.
Yeah.
A couple of things. I enjoyed the stimulation and lots of debate. Regarding the last question, I was just reading today the account of the Nephilim, you know, the Genesis record of the angelic interacting with humans. And I think the outcome of that wasn't very good from our understanding of the reading. So there is a precedent there of some cross of a God-created order with another God-created order.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not trying to raise questions. I'm just saying there are examples in the Bible. The other comment I was just going to make to finish off on is, as an architect, we were always given maxims for being a good designer. And one of them is form follows function. So when you look at all the animals and so many things, the form is determined by the function. So the question you always got to ask is, what is the intended function with everything that's created? That's an important thing. So I don't support the evolutionary idea that it's a whole lot of random, chancy things. I believe everything can be explained as it's got a purpose and a function, and therefore God builds into it all the mechanisms to make it fully functional.
You know, I love the idea of thinking about biology from an architectural standpoint, you know, and you know, I'm because so often I think we think of biological systems kind of from an engineering standpoint, which is fine, but there is a, you know, an element of beauty, you know, that you see in organisms. And, you know, architects are, you know, I'm saying this as a biochemist to an architect, so you please feel free to soundly correct me, you know. But, you know, it seems to me that architects are interested both in the beauty as well as in the functionality of their designs. And I see that in biological systems. And, you know, at least there seems to be some architects that almost seem to be more concerned with the form than the function, you know, you know, and that there's certain styles that you see that those architects, you know, employing in a recurring manner. But yet it's remarkable to think that you could have these highly aesthetic forms that might even recur, you know, in architectural designs, but yet still use those forms to produce a wide range of functionality. So in other words, form and function aren't necessarily in opposition to each other, right? But they seem to be most beautifully expressed when they are working in conjunction with each other. And I think you see that in living organisms, particularly with respect to homologies. So I'm just curious your reaction to my naive statements there.
I agree. No, the beauty and the function are all part of the intended order, I believe. It's just reflecting how things are from God's perspective.
Yeah, when you talk about function and form, like I think about like some Australian animals like the wombat, for an example. He's a marsupial, and so he has a pouch, but for the wombat, the pouch is in reverse, so that when the mother is digging a burrow, and wombat's always digging, no dirt goes into the pouch. Like, you know, not all the other marsupials have it facing the other way, but for the wombat, it's the reverse. It's fascinating that the form is there. Yeah. So I think on that note, we will finish the recording, but don't go everyone yet. We'll say goodbye. But really thank you, Fuzz, for contributing so much tonight. It's excellent. Yeah, fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very, very much.